I never planned to stay in that small town. That is what he told himself the first evening, standing on the wooden platform in Silver Creek, Colorado, with the San Juan Range folded into blue shadow behind him and the September light thinning across the tin roofs. He said it aloud to the horse, quietly, so the station master would not hear. I never planned to stay in that small town. He meant it the way a man means a thing he has not yet been tested on. Ethan Calloway was 32 years old that autumn of 1889, a former cavalry farrier out of Fort Union, 6 feet in his boots, sun-browned across the cheekbones, with dark hair cut short under a flat-brimmed hat and eyes the color of creek water in shade. He wore a canvas coat gone soft at the elbows, a dark wool vest, denim trousers, and boots that had walked him out of 2 wars and 1 bad marriage he did not talk about. He carried 1 saddle, 1 bedroll, a leather case of farrier tools, and 47 in silver. He was on his way to Durango. Silver Creek was a stop for water and a night's rest. Nothing more. That was the plan. The town was 214 souls by the last count, tucked into a bend of the Rio de los Animas, 42 miles north of Durango and 18 south of the pass. There was a mercantile, a livery, a church that leaned slightly east, a schoolhouse painted the color of new butter, and a boarding house run by a widow named Miriam Homestead who charged $1 a night and threw in supper. Ethan paid his $1. He ate his supper. He slept in a room that smelled of lavender and pine soap. In the morning, at first light, he meant to ride out. He did not ride out. The mare threw a shoe crossing the yard, and the town blacksmith was 3 days gone to a funeral in Pueblo. That was the first thing. The second thing was the woman at the far end of Miriam's long breakfast table, sitting alone with a cup of coffee, wearing a dark blue dress buttoned to the collar and long at the wrist, her sleeves cuffed neatly, a small silver cross at her throat. She was reading a battered ledger. She did not look up when he sat down. She did not look up when Miriam introduced her as Clara Whitfield. She said good morning to her coffee, and Ethan Calloway, without meaning to, said good morning back. Clara Whitfield was 29 years old. Her hair was the color of dry wheat, gathered into a low braid that lay against the collar of her dress. Her eyes were gray, with a way of resting on a thing without demanding anything of it. She had lived in Silver Creek 11 years. She had buried her father, a schoolmaster, when she was 21, and her husband, a millwright named Jonas, when she was 24. Since Jonas had gone under the ice of the Animas the winter of 1884, Clara had run her father's schoolhouse alone, taught 18 children 5 days a week, kept a small cabin on 4 acres east of the creek, tended a garden, a milk cow named Bess, and 6 brown hens. She was, by any honest measure, the most capable and least visible person in Silver Creek. The town had a way of not seeing her. They saw the widow Halstead because she poured their coffee. They saw Pastor Ellery because he stood up in front of them on Sundays. They saw the banker's daughter, Adelaide Prince, 22 and unmarried and glossy as a new penny, because she made herself easy to see. They did not see Clara Whitfield. She had been a fixture so long she had gone the way of fixtures, the kind of thing a room contains without noticing. When someone needed a letter written for a mother who could not read, they walked to Clara's cabin. When a child was ill in the night, they walked to Clara's cabin. When old man Peterson's fever broke in April and he asked, later, who had sat with him through the worst of it, no one could quite remember. It had been Clara. It was always Clara. The town did not remember because the town did not look. Ethan Calloway looked. He looked at breakfast because she was the only quiet person in a loud room, and quiet was what he had come out of the war wanting. He looked when she left the boarding house at 7, ledger tucked under her arm, walking east toward the schoolhouse with a stride that was neither hurried nor slow. He looked when she passed the mercantile and Adelaide Prince, standing on the plank walk in a pale rose dress, said brightly, "Good morning, Miss Whitfield," and Clara nodded back and did not stop, and Adelaide's smile went thin at the edges as though she had been ignored, though it was Clara who had been ignored first, every day, for 11 years. That evening, Ethan walked out to the livery to check on the mare. The blacksmith was still gone. The livery boy, a red-headed 12-year-old named Sam, said the smith would be back Thursday, maybe Friday, and Ethan nodded and said he'd wait. He walked back through town in the long blue dusk, and passed the schoolhouse, and saw a light in the small window at the back. He stopped. He watched, for the length of a slow breath. A woman in a dark blue dress bent over a desk, marking a stack of slates by lamplight, alone in a building meant for 18. He walked on. He told himself he was walking on. The next morning, at breakfast, Miriam poured his coffee and said, "Lo, that west fence of hers is coming down. She hasn't the time. She hasn't the hands. Her nearest neighbor is old Cy Marston, and Cy Marston hasn't lifted a hammer since '86. She set it into the coffee, not looking at Ethan, the way a woman gives a man an opportunity without asking him to take it. Clara Whitfield was at the far end of the table again, reading her ledger, and did not hear. Ethan finished his coffee. He walked to the livery. He borrowed a claw hammer, a fencing pliers, a coil of wire, and a bundle of split cedar posts Sam said Cy Marston had left leaning against the north wall 6 months ago and never come back for. He walked the 1.25 miles to the 4 acres east of the creek. He did not knock on the cabin door. He walked around to the west fence, where 3 posts had rotted at the base and 2 lengths of wire had come free, and he set to work. He worked through the morning. The wind came down off the range with the smell of dry sage and cold stone. He drove the new posts deep, tamped the earth, tightened the wire, mended the gate where a hinge had pulled. He did not stop for water. At noon, when the sun had come high and the mountains had gone pale in it, he walked to the creek's edge and drank from his hands, and walked back, and finished the last 20 yards of wire before the light turned. He was gathering his tools when he saw her, standing at the porch corner, ledger still in her hand, watching him. She did not smile. She did not thank him. She said quietly, "Who told you?" "Miriam." Clara considered this. Then she said, "The gate hinge. Fixed. The post by the water gap." "New." She nodded once, small. "There's stew," she said. "If you're hungry." He ate at her small kitchen table. The stew was venison and turnip and thick with pepper, and there was cornbread in a black pan and a cup of buttermilk. She sat across from him and asked no questions. He asked none back. He learned, that night, from Miriam, that Clara Whitfield had not sat at a table with a man since Jonas died 5 winters ago, except her own father before the father died, and even then only for a handful of suppers. He learned it and he sat with it and he told himself again, "I never planned to stay in that small town." The next morning the blacksmith was still gone. Ethan walked out to the 4 acres and mended the east gate that Cy Marston had promised twice to mend and never had. He did not go to the cabin. He worked and he left the tools stacked by the post and he walked back to town at dusk. Miriam had a plate warm for him. She did not ask where he had been. She knew. On the 3rd day the town began to notice. The town of Silver Creek did not notice Clara Whitfield, but it noticed a stranger noticing Clara Whitfield, and this was a different kind of arithmetic. At the Mercantile, Adelaide Prince, 22 and glossy as a new penny, asked her father, loud enough to carry, whether the new man from Fort Union might be persuaded to stay for the harvest dance. At the boarding house, 2 of the older women, Mrs. Ellery, the pastor's wife, and Mrs. Halstead's sister Ada, sat over their needlework and agreed warmly that it was such a shame Clara Whitfield had no one, and such a lovely thing when a young man showed a bit of kindness, and did anyone happen to know if he was staying, and had anyone thought to introduce Adelaide, who really was quite accomplished and could speak French. Old Cy Marston, who had not lifted a hammer since '86 and who had, in his own way, loved Clara's late father like a brother, sat on his porch that same afternoon and watched Ethan Calloway carry a bundle of split cedar down the road toward the 4 acres and said, to no one, "About time somebody did." Cy Marston was, from that day on, the first voice of the town chorus. He would not be the last. By the end of the first week, the blacksmith had come back from Pueblo. The mare had a new shoe, and Ethan Calloway had not left. He told himself, walking through town in the cold October light, that it was on account of a set of harness he had been asked to mend at the livery for a fair price. He told himself, the second week, that it was on account of the roof at the schoolhouse, which was leaking over the reading corner where the smallest children sat, and which no one else in town knew how to shingle properly. He told himself, the third week, that it was on account of a mare Cy Marston wanted looked at, and a plowshare for Miriam's brother-in-law, and a set of hinges for the church door. He knew, telling himself a great many things. The days took on a shape. He rose at first light with the stove crackling in Miriam's kitchen below, ate a plate of eggs and salt pork and thick brown bread, and walked out with his tools slung over one shoulder. He mended what needed mending in town in the morning. A broken axle here, a bent hinge there, a set of horseshoes for the freight team out of Pueblo, and in the afternoon he walked the 1.25 miles to the 4 acres and did the quiet work that was not asked of him. He rebuilt the corner of the woodshed where a marmot had chewed through the sill. He set 2 new rails in the pasture fence. He repaired the well handle. He never spoke of any of it. He never asked for coffee. He never asked to come in. He worked, and he left the tools stacked by the post, and he walked back to town at dusk with the last of the light draining out of the western sky behind him. And every evening, from the second week on, there was a small covered plate of something on the boarding house counter with his name written in a schoolteacher's careful hand. A wedge of pie, a jar of preserved plums, a folded parcel of buttered biscuits, left there by Clara without a word on her way home from the schoolhouse. He did not thank her. She did not want thanks. That was, he understood by the end of the second week, the entire language they had already agreed on without speaking of it. Miriam Homestead, who missed nothing, poured his coffee one morning and said, "Dry. You know she has never left a plate for anyone at this counter in 11 years. Ethan said nothing. Miriam nodded to herself and did not say another word about it. Some things a woman like Miriam Homestead only needs to note once. The children began to notice too, in the small way children notice. The little Doyle girl, 7 years old and gap-toothed, tugged Ethan's coat sleeve on the plank walk outside the mercantile and asked whether it was true he was Miss Whitfield's friend, and Ethan, caught between the honest word and the careful one, said, "I am, yes." The girl nodded, satisfied, and said, "She is my friend also," and walked on. Ethan stood a moment on the plank walk with the cold October wind coming down out of the range, and thought that in 11 years no one in Silver Creek had said, out loud, that Clara Whitfield was their friend, and that a 7-year-old was, in her small, unhurried way, the second voice of the town chorus. Pastor Ellery came to the schoolhouse on a Thursday afternoon in mid-October, when Ethan was up on the roof laying cedar shingles over the reading corner, and stood at the base of the ladder with his hat in his hand, and said, "Mr. Calloway, I have watched you 3 weeks. I have said nothing because there was nothing yet to say. I say now only this: a good man is known by the labor he does when no one is watching. I have been watching. I do not think you have known it. I have been watching, and I have been thanking God for you, quietly every evening, on behalf of a woman who has not been thanked, out loud, in this town since before her father died." He put his hat back on his head. He walked away down the road. Ethan sat on the ridge of the schoolhouse roof for a long minute afterward with his hammer resting across his knees, and he did not trust himself, just then, to climb down. On a Tuesday in mid-October, he walked out to the 4 acres carrying a small pane of window glass wrapped in newspaper, and a set of trim and a miter box he had borrowed from Sam. He did not knock. He walked around to the east wall of Clara Whitfield's cabin, where a single square window looked out over her garden and past the garden toward the mountains and the sunrise. The window frame had warped years ago. The pane had a long crack across it. Ethan had noticed it the first night he had eaten stew at her table. He had noticed how she had risen at first light and stood at that window before she had made coffee, and how she had not been able to see clearly through it. He built her a new window frame. He set the new pane. He trimmed it clean and mitered the corners and rubbed the wood with a little linseed oil until it took a soft honey shine. He set the frame so the east light would fall directly onto the small kitchen table where she took her breakfast. He worked through the morning and into the early afternoon quietly without calling out. In the pocket of his coat, that morning, he had carried a smoothed riverstone the size of his thumb. One Jonas Whitfield had given Clara's father the summer before Jonas died. Miriam had pressed it into Ethan's palm at breakfast and said only, it was on the sill of the old window. She could not bear to move it. Put it back on the sill of the new one, and do not tell her I gave it to you. He set the stone on the fresh honey oil sill, exactly where it had been. When he came around the porch corner to gather his tools, Clara was standing at the door. She had been watching him. He did not know how long. She said, "Why the east side?" He said, "So you'd have good light. In the morning." She said nothing to that. She only stood there, one hand on the doorframe, and her eyes were wet, and she did not look away. That was the thing about Clara Whitfield. She did not look away. He had a memory of the first breakfast, of her not looking up. He had a memory of that ledger. He understood, standing there in the October light, that not looking up and not looking away were the same discipline in a woman who had spent 11 years being unseen and had decided, at some point, not to flinch at anything. She said, "You'll be leaving soon." He said, "That was the plan." She nodded. Then she said very quietly, "There's stew." He ate at the table. The east window let in the last of the afternoon light, and it fell across the pine boards in a long warm bar, and neither of them commented on it. That is what love looks like when it doesn't announce itself. It just quietly faces east. The chorus began to speak in October. Miriam Halstead, over morning coffee, said to Ethan, "You know she was engaged once before Jonas. To a boy from Pueblo. He rode out to file a claim in '82 and never came back. Never wrote. Never sent word. She waited 14 months before she took the ring off, and she took it off on a Tuesday in the schoolhouse in front of no one." Miriam poured his coffee and did not look at him. "I only mention it because that was the last time she let herself want a thing and be visible about it. She has not, since, been visible about wanting anything at all. So if you're leaving, leave. But if you're not leaving, be plain about it. She has had enough of men who ride out and don't say goodbye." Old Cy Marston, sitting on his porch, said, "Boy, that woman is worth 10 of any that's ever set foot in this valley, and no one's noticed for 11 years, and it is a slow shame on this town, and I hope you have the sense to see what the town could not." Pastor Ellery, in the doorway of the leaning church, said only, "She sat with my mother the last 3 nights. No one asked her to. No one thanked her. I thank her now, and I thank you for the new hinges, and I will say again, a good man is known by the labor he does when no one is watching." Adelaide Prince, in a pale rose dress on the plank walk, said brightly, "Mr. Calloway, we so hoped you would come to the harvest dance. I have saved you a place at our family's table," and Ethan Calloway, who had spent a life around horses and had learned to read a flick of an ear, saw the whole conversation for what it was and touched his hat and said, "Kindly, thank you, Miss Prince. I have other plans." He did not look back to see her smile go thin. He was, by then, done with rooms in which Clara Whitfield was not the person being seen. The harvest dance was the last Saturday of October, in the barn behind the mercantile, with lanterns hung on wire and a fiddle and a set of bright red apples in barrels and half the town in their good clothes. Ethan Calloway wore the same canvas coat, brushed clean, and a fresh shirt Miriam had pressed for him without being asked. Clara Whitfield did not come. Clara Whitfield never came. 11 years, and Clara Whitfield had never once come to the harvest dance, and no one had thought it strange enough to speak of. Ethan stood a while inside the barn, in the warm noise of it, watching the young men circle the young women, watching Adelaide Prince laugh a little too brightly at something the banker's clerk had said, watching Cy Marston lean on a post by the door with a cup of cider in his hand and a knowing look in his eye. Ethan did not dance. He touched the brim of his hat to Mrs. Ellery. He shook Pastor Ellery's hand. Then he asked Miriam, quietly at the door, "Is she at home?" Miriam said, "She is." He left the barn. He walked, in the cold October dark, the 1.25 miles east to the 4 acres. He walked past the mended west fence and the mended east gate and the east window with the honey oil trim, and he stopped at the split-rail fence at the north edge of the yard, where the land began to fall toward the creek, and where a person standing there could see the whole valley and the mountains beyond, and where Clara Whitfield stood, in her dark blue dress and a heavier shawl of gray wool, her braid loose over one shoulder, looking out at the dark shape of the San Juans against the last of the western light. He came to the fence and stopped on the other side of it. He did not cross it. He set his hands on the top rail. He said, "You didn't come." She said, "I don't go." He said, "I know. I came instead." There was a long quiet. The wind moved down out of the range with the smell of first frost, and the creek ran, and somewhere down in town a fiddle carried, thin on the air. Clara Whitfield looked at him across the split rail, and Ethan Calloway looked back, and neither of them looked away. He said, "I never planned to stay in that small town. I was on my way to Durango. I meant to be gone in a morning." And then a mare threw a shoe, and I sat down at a breakfast table, and there was a woman at the far end of it that no one in this town had looked at properly in 11 years. And I looked, and I have been looking since. And I am not going to Durango. Clara Whitfield's eyes went wet, and she did not look away. She said quietly, you know they call it kindness. What you've been doing. Miriam calls it kindness. I calls it kindness. Even the pastor calls it kindness. He said, it isn't. She said, I know. She said, say it plain. He said, I would like to stay. I would like to build a life on this side of the fence, with you on the other side of it, until there is no fence between us at all. I would like to spend the years I have left doing the work of a man who has finally seen the person he was meant to see. I do not want a harvest dance. I do not want a town's approval. I want your good morning, when you say it, to be to me. Clara Whitfield stood very still. Then she stepped forward. She put her hand on the top rail of the fence, next to his so that their fingers touched, and she said, then come around. He came around. They stood on the same side of the fence, and Clara Whitfield, who had been the woman everyone forgot, put her forehead against his shoulder, and Ethan Calloway, who had never planned to stay, put his hand against the small of her back, over the dark blue wool, and neither of them said another word for a long time. Grief doesn't leave. It just learns to share the house with other things. There was, later that week, one small friction. Adelaide Prince, in a pale rose dress and with her father Mr. Prince the banker beside her, met Ethan on the plank walk outside the mercantile on a Wednesday. Mr. Prince, who was not an unkind man, only a proud one, said evenly, Mr. Calloway, my daughter tells me you have taken up with the Whitfield woman. I would only say, a man of your evident competence could do better, in this town, than a widow of 30 years with no family and less society. There is a good livery position open in Durango. I have written the letter. It is yours if you wish it. Ethan Calloway looked at Mr. Prince for a long moment. Then he looked briefly at Adelaide, who was, he saw for the first time, not glossy but frightened. In the small way a young woman is frightened when she has been raised to believe she is the highest prize in a small valley and has just been told quietly that the appraisal was wrong. He said to Mr. Prince, Sir, your daughter is a fine young woman, and I mean her no disrespect, but you have used the wrong word. The word is not better. The word is easier, and I have had enough of the easier road for one life. Mr. Prince set his jaw. He did not at once yield. He said, and there was real weight behind it, Mr. Calloway. I have lived in this valley 31 years. I buried a wife here. I built the bank here. I have watched more good young men ride into Silver Creek on their way to somewhere richer and ride out again 3 months later poorer than they came. Do not mistake my counsel for cruelty. I have said the same in private to my own daughter, that easy roads eat a life sooner than hard ones. But I have also said that a man ought to know the difference between courage and stubbornness, and I am not yet convinced you do. Clara Whitfield is a fine woman. She is also, I will tell you plain, a woman who has never once let herself be helped, and I have watched that cost her, and I would not wish that cost on you. He paused. He looked, for the first time, tired. Reconsider the letter. That is all I will say. Ethan did not flinch. He said, Sir, I hear you. I do not think you are cruel. I think you have watched, from a bank window, a woman who has done more good unseen in this valley than any of us has done seen. She is not a woman who has never let herself be helped. She is a woman no one has troubled to help. There is a difference, and I would ask you, sir, only this, the next time she passes you on the plank walk. Look up. That is all. Just look up. Mr. Prince did not answer at once. He looked, for a moment, less proud and more tired, the way a man looks when he has been shown a small true thing he had not troubled to notice. He said, At last I will consider that, and I will ask my daughter to consider it also. He touched his hat. He said, Good day, Mr. Calloway, and he walked on with Adelaide beside him, and Adelaide, before she turned the corner, looked back over her shoulder, and there was something in her face that was, for the first time, not glossy at all, and something like the beginning of a woman who might, in time, learn to see. The wedding was in April of 1890, in the leaning church, on a morning of new green light coming down through the cottonwoods along the Onimus. Clara wore a plain dark green dress her mother had worn in 1858, buttoned to the collar and long at the wrist, and her mother's small silver cross at her throat, and her hair in a low braid with one sprig of wild plum blossom tucked into it. Ethan wore the canvas coat, brushed clean, and a new dark vest, and the same boots. Miriam Halstead cried into her handkerchief. Cy Marston, who had not lifted a hammer since '86, had, that morning, lifted a hymnal and sang. Pastor Ellery married them in 9 minutes. He said, when it was done, "A good man is known by the labor he does when no one is watching. A good woman is known by the years she gives before anyone thinks to thank her. Today we are all thanking her at once. It is late. It is not too late." That summer Ethan built a new porch on the east side of the cabin, wide enough for 2 chairs, facing the sunrise. That autumn he mended the schoolhouse roof properly, with new shingles cut from cedar. That winter their first child, a girl they named Ruth, was born in the small room off the kitchen where the east window let in the morning. Clara went on teaching for 2 more years, and then a young woman named Emma Doyle, who had grown up on Clara's slates, came home from a normal school in Denver and took the schoolhouse over, and Clara stayed at home with Ruth and later with a boy they named Jonah after Clara's father. The town slowly learned to look up. Adelaide Prince married a young lawyer from Alamosa the following spring and moved away, and 2 years after that wrote Clara a letter out of no obligation and no one's asking that said, in part, "I did not know how to see you, and I am sorry for it, and I hope Ruth grows up in a town that has learned to see her mother the way I did not." Clara wrote back, warmly, and they exchanged letters twice a year for the rest of Adelaide's life. Old Cy Marston lived to be 89. Miriam Halstead ran the boarding house until 1907. Pastor Ellery preached one last sermon in the Leaning Church in the spring of 1902 on a text of his own choosing, and the text was, "A good man is known by the labor he does when no one is watching," and half the town wept, and no one in the town of Silver Creek, from that April on, ever forgot Clara Whitfield again. Ethan Calloway lived to be 71. He died on a morning in late September of 1928, in the small back bedroom of the cabin on the 4 acres, with Ruth on one side of the bed and Jonah on the other and Clara at the foot, and the east window open, and the first cool light of a Colorado autumn falling across the pine boards in a long warm bar. He had spent 39 years on that side of the fence. He had never once, in any of them, regretted the mare that threw the shoe. And on the sill of the east window that morning sat a smoothed river stone the size of a thumb, which had been there for 39 years, and which Clara Whitfield, when she rose from the foot of the bed, closed her hand around and did not let go of for a long time. If you are watching this tonight, wherever you are, I would ask you only this. Look up. There is, in your town or on your street, or at the far end of your own long table, a person the room has stopped seeing. Not because they are hidden, because they are quiet and steady, and have been near you so long you have gone the way of not looking. Look up. Say good morning. Ask about the ledger. Notice the east-facing window. The person the world forgets is almost always the person the world could not have done without, and the small quiet act of turning your face toward them is, in the end, the only love language that has ever mattered. Thank you for riding this trail with me tonight. If the story moved you, tell me in the comments where in the world you are watching from, and who the quiet, steady person is in your own life that you mean to look at properly tomorrow morning. And if you loved this one, stay with me. Next time we ride out together, I want to tell you the story of a widowed rancher in the high country who takes in a silent young drifter one November night, and the single winter that changes them both. In a small tale I am calling The Drifter Who Wouldn't Say His Name. Until next time, keep riding.